Good morning. I'm Ellen Horseman, and I'm a Sunday school teacher with the Camden, Arkansas First United Methodist Church. We've been working our way through a series of parables of Jesus, and we're going to take one today from the 18th chapter of Luke. Now, I'm going to tell you, if you are a watcher of this video, that you may see the cat's tail. Maybe the cat will actually show her face at some point, but she's just determined to get on me. And if you are listening to the podcast, then just imagine that suddenly you see a tail flick by with nothing else going on. But let me get to the Sunday school lesson. From the 18th chapter of Luke, beginning with verse 9. Now Jesus told this parable to certain people who had convinced themselves that they were righteous, and who looked on everyone else with disgust. Two people went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself, and he said, God, I thank you that I'm not like everyone else, crooks and evildoers and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of everything I receive. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even lift his eyes towards heaven, but rather he struck his chest, and he said, God, show mercy to me, a sinner. I tell you, this person went down to his home justified rather than the Pharisee. For all who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. So Maxie Dunham begins his chapter on this particular parable by saying, or asking us, what is your most common sin? And I have to tell you, when I read that, I thought, what? I don't mean to say I'm not a sinner. I mean to say I don't often try to decide which is my most common sin, and I'm not sure that I would have come up with what Dunham says is our most common sin. And that is pride, or maybe a better way of putting it would be to say self-righteousness. That this parable is about self-righteousness is pretty obvious because of the way Jesus begins it in verse 9, or rather the way Luke prefaces it before it begins, when he says that Jesus told the parable to certain people who had convinced themselves that they were righteous and who looked on everyone else with disgust. So obviously self-righteousness, which obviously is a form of pride, is a bad sin. Jesus will say at the end of this parable that the Pharisee did not go home justified. So I'm going to leave Dunham's question for a minute, and I'm going to ask you a question of my own. And this is the question. Which one of the two guys in this parable do you think would be the good guy, and which one do you think would be the bad guy? I mean, it seems pretty obvious to us who the good guy is. It's supposed to be the tax collector and not the Pharisee. It's about as obvious, I would say, as the old black and white westerns with the guys in the white hats and the guys in black hats. And if you're too young to know what I mean, I can tell you when I was a kid, we didn't we had television, but we didn't have movies on television yet. So we'd go to the theater, matinee theater on a Saturday afternoon and watch these old cowboy movies. And you always knew the good guys when they came on because they were wearing white hats. The bad guys were wearing black hats. And the kids would cheer when the good guys came on. And at the end of the movie, I can remember this big theater would be packed full of kids. And the good guys would beat the bad guys. And all the kids would holler out, "Yay!" as one big collective group. So it seems pretty obvious to us. Who's the good guy in this parable? Well, obviously, it's the tax collector. That's what most of us would say, and most of us would see the Pharisee as the bad guy. We might even inwardly cheer like the kids in that movie theater, let out a little inward yay when we hear the Pharisee get his comeuppance. When Jesus says that it's the tax collector, the guy who would have been considered the big sinner, the guy that the Pharisee thanked God he was not like, when Jesus says that tax collector is the one who went home justified rather than the Pharisee. So take that, Pharisee, you old black hat guy. We knew you were bad. We've got it all figured out. The tax collector is the good guy. He's the one who goes home justified. And so this parable is simple. Let's see. Don't be too proud. Be humble like the tax collector. Don't be proud like the Pharisee. Be humble like the tax collector. Why, that's as easy as an old Western movie with white hats and black hats, isn't it? Or maybe not. Because let's take another look at that Pharisee. Now, I know I've said this in Sunday school before, but I'm going to say it again. The Pharisee would not have been considered a bad guy by the people who were listening to Jesus. The idea that, if you're going to use the white hat, black hat analogy, the idea that the Pharisee was not the guy with the white hat, that somehow this tax collector was, would have been crazy to these people. I don't even know if I can come up with a good analogy in our day, but I will say that the Pharisee would have been like the person that we think of as like the pillar of the community, one of the people in the church that can always be counted on to be there, one of the people in the church that always seems to give plenty of money, seems to help out whenever the church needs some kind of help, the kind of person we would maybe even look up to. The tax collector, on the other hand, those guys were considered the biggest sinners back in Jesus's day. They usually were hated because in collecting taxes for Rome, they often cheated and took a bunch of extra money for themselves and basically took advantage of other people. So they're like the lowest of the low. So think of the worst kind of derelict or the worst kind of sinner or the most selfish person you could think of, and that's what we would have labeled the tax collector. So we naturally would have assumed when we began to hear this story that the Pharisee was going to be the good guy. And it would have been shocking indeed that the Pharisee is not the good guy. And let's take another look at this Pharisee, though, because besides the fact that the people of his day would not consider him a bad guy, we wouldn't consider him a bad guy either if we knew someone like this. I mean, we've become accustomed to thinking of the Pharisees as the bad guys because they seem to be the bad guys in a lot of these stories with Jesus. But we would have been looking up to the Pharisee. And the Pharisee is not wrong about some of the things he says. He says, well, I'm not a crook, and I'm not an evildoer, and I'm not an adulterer. And he's not. And yeah, we would think of a crook or an evildoer or an adulterer as being a pretty bad guy. And the Pharisee's not any of those. He doesn't do what we would consider really bad things. And what's more, righteousness at that time especially was considered to be right under the law, to do what is correct under the law. And the Pharisee is a law follower. As a matter of fact, when he ticks off the things that he does, we discover that he is not only following the law of Moses, he is going above and beyond the law of Moses. So he does more than maybe just come to church on Sunday. He's the person that does everything that you would expect a church person today to do. And even as in his prayer, what he is saying about how he's grateful not to be like these bad people or like the tax collector, how is that any different than us saying something like, well, there but for the grace of God go I. Yeah, we say that sometimes when someone has misfortune, but we often say it when we see someone messing up. There but for the grace of God go I. And what we really mean is, I'm sure glad I'm not like that person. But wait a minute. Is the Pharisee a bad guy or isn't he a bad guy? I mean, didn't Jesus say that he did not go home justified like the tax collector did? And didn't Jesus say that those who lift themselves up will be brought low? And weren't we, as we began to hear this story, secretly congratulating ourselves that we're not like the Pharisee? Stop and think about that for a minute. When you hear this story, don't you look down on the Pharisee? Don't you look at that Pharisee and think, oh, he is so self-righteous. And the irony of it is that when we do that, when we judge that Pharisee, we are being just like he is. When we read this story, we're either congratulating ourselves that we're not like the Pharisee, or we may be also berating ourselves a little bit because we're not as humble as the tax collector. Well, friends, I think that is part of the point of this story. When we begin to compare ourselves to the Pharisee, when we begin to compare ourselves to the tax collector, then we're giving in to that all too human worldly impulse to make comparisons between ourselves and other people. We are falling into the same trap that the Pharisee falls into. We are seeing our relationship with God and with each other in terms of the world's economy. In the world's economy, we have a place where we get ahead by our own efforts. We have a place where there are winners and losers. We have a place where we measure our success by comparing and contrasting ourselves with other people. The Pharisee thinks that his standing with God depends on what he, the Pharisee, does. That's the reason he's making that comparison. He wants to make himself feel better because he really believes that his standing with God is based on his own efforts. And it is hard not to think like that. The Pharisee sees his own value in relationship to the value of the tax collector and other people. And the problem with making those kinds of comparisons is that when we do that, we become self-righteous because we want to feel good. So when we compare ourselves to other people, most of the time we're going to come out feeling like we're better than they are, even if we don't admit it to ourselves. There, but for the grace of God, go I. The problem with that is we become self-righteous. And when we become self-righteous, we end up cutting ourselves off from our neighbors and cutting ourselves off from God. We cut ourselves off from our neighbors or from other people because we can't love them, truly love them, as God has called us to love them, because they are our competitors, and we're constantly comparing ourselves with them. And we cut ourselves off from the love of God, not because God withholds his love, but because we don't accept it. You see, when we start becoming self-righteous, when we start comparing ourselves to other people and thinking we look pretty good by comparison, or when we congratulate ourselves that we're not such a bad sinner, we forget about our need to grow. We lose a sense of our need for God's forgiveness and our need for God's grace. And we see it all as dependent upon us. But my friends, grace is not something we earn. Grace is not a pecking order. Grace is not about me being better than someone else. Grace is not about me being less of a sinner than someone else. Grace is about God's love extended to all people, even to the tax collector, even to the worst person you can think of, and even to the Pharisee, and even to you, and even to me. Jesus says the tax collector goes home justified. Because think about it. The tax collector was feeling so humble that Jesus says in his story that he wouldn't even lift his eyes up to heaven, but beat upon himself and said, "Be merciful to me, I am a sinner." He humbled himself in the sight of the Lord because the tax collector realized that compared to God, he was nothing. The tax collector realized that he was unworthy of God's love. And yet God gives it to him anyway. The tax collector is justified not because of what the tax collector does. He is justified because God says he is justified. Let me be clear on that word justified. It means to be put in a right relationship with God, to be in a good relationship with God. The tax collector is justified because God says that he is justified. God considers him righteous or in a just relationship with him. The tax collector is justified. The tax collector is righteous because God says he is righteous, as God will say that we are righteous when we're able to accept God's righteousness. Now the Pharisee, he doesn't go home justified. He doesn't go home righteous because he hasn't learned yet that God's love is unconditional. And so he can't really receive it. He hasn't learned yet that God's marvelous grace is free. that God's love does not depend on human efforts. He hasn't learned yet that he does not have to earn God's love. He hasn't learned that yet, and God longs for him to learn it. God longs for him to accept God's love and to learn to become the very image of love and grace and kindness that God created him to be. My friends, God wants you to wear a white hat, so to speak. God wants you to be justified or be in a right relationship with him. God wants to give that to you as a gift, not as something you have to earn, not as something that you have to worry about how it stacks up in comparison to anyone else. God longs to make you free of sin, free of guilt, and in just and righteous standing in his eyes. He has a white hat to give you. He has a white hat for the Pharisee, so to speak, and he has a white hat for the tax collector. And he stands ready to help us put on the white hat of God's righteousness, to defeat the demons of judgmentalism and self-righteousness and pecking orders and anxieties about how we compare to other people. God has a white hat for us, and he longs for us to let ourselves go and to be the persons that he created us to be. May we, like the tax collector, learn to humble ourselves in the sight of God, learn to recognize our need, and to accept God's wonderful, redeeming love and mercy and grace. Yay! And God bless you all, my friends. Have a wonderful week.